In 1903, the Wright brothers invented the airplane. It was hard to imagine then that today there would be over 500,000 people traveling in the air at any point in time. In 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto invented Bitcoin and the blockchain. For the first time in history, his invention made it possible to send money around the globe without banks, governments, or any other intermediaries. Satoshi is a mystery character, and just like the Wright brothers, he solved an unsolvable problem. Whenever this happens, it inspires incredible innovation. The concept of the blockchain isn't very intuitive, but still many people believe it's a game changer. Despite its mysterious beginnings, the blockchain may be the airplane of our time.
I found out about blockchain first, as most people around that time were, through Bitcoin. And personally, at first, I thought that Bitcoin was an absolutely terrible idea.
I was teaching at Stanford back in 2010, and a teaching assistant for the class sent me an article. She said, oh, there's this really cool thing. It's open source money. And I remember thinking, open source money, isn't that cool? But it'll probably never work.
I did what most people do the first moment they are exposed to Bitcoin. I discounted it. I thought this was silly internet money. You could mine it. It's like a golden goose. And it took me about a year to really re-explore the technology. And so by 2012, I did what I tell most people to do today, is turn off your phone, lock your door, and study this technology for a day. It's the best advice I could give.
I was on a sabbatical from work and decided I'd take a year off, live off some savings, figure out what I want to do. It was there that I discovered this little orange icon with a bee in the middle. I said, what is this strange thing? So I started looking, okay, Bitcoin, interesting. That was about 2012, 2013. And I haven't left the space since. I've just continued further and further down the blockchain rabbit hole, if you will. And I've been pleasantly surprised and had no reason to crawl my way back out and find another technology.
There's a point at which it's almost like you can't stop. It just gets so interesting, and you're so fascinated by it, and you just want to learn more and more and more. And even, by the way, to this day, it's almost, there are new developments. You know, there are new ways of solving problems, new approaches, and it's very exciting to be in this world.
It feels really exciting to be involved in blockchain. Feels like we're at the forefront of something that has at least the potential to transform our interactions between each other, between corporations, the underlying infrastructure of both the private sector, but also of government.
For me, part of the fascination is that we don't yet know exactly what this thing is, and yet there was still lots of people gathering around it. You know, I thought of it as like, you know, a space rock that crashed on Earth, right? You'd have a bunch of people that gather around, and they're all pointing, what is this thing? And you don't really know what it is, but it's still very interesting.
So for me personally, the blockchain has two main ingredients, two main technical ingredients. So one ingredient is cryptography. And when I say cryptography, I really mean asymmetric cryptography. And the other ingredient is so-called distributed systems. But these are the two main things. If you understand these two things, then basically you understand all the technical details of blockchain or Bitcoin, for that matter.
You have the ability to create records that are indelible. You have the ability to transfer value by making updates to those records. And you have the ability to automate updates to the records through these things called smart contracts. And that means potentially that you could transform the structure of financial services. Today, there are all sorts of institutions that exist to maintain sets of records, to be a trusted third party is the industry parlance for it. And that role is potentially fundamentally reshaped.
Blockchains are networks. And networks that we see today, Alibaba, Airbnb, Uber, those are interesting networks, but they're centralized networks. Here, you're going to have networks that are decentralized, that are working more on as a cooperative. I think some of the challenges will be what are the economics of those networks, what are the economics of certain blockchains versus today's discussion, which is all about the technology. I think tomorrow's discussion will be about how do you build network effects off of these new railroads.
And what's especially interesting for me is that it was a grassroots movement from the technology sector, not sort of the movement of established businesses trying to get in to find a new selling point. It's really a bottom-up movement from us geeks.
It's one of the most amazing things in science that happened in the last 100 years, that this thing is actually possible, that you can digitally sign transactions or other kinds of information so that you can prove to people that you actually signed this. It's much more secure than these, curvy, wriggly signatures we usually use in our everyday life. And it probably will replace those things soon enough.
We spent 2 years trying to understand this space and what it really meant, and we found out that it meant a lot more than just another digital currency. It actually, as the blockchain became more influential in our thinking, we began to realize that it was a profound shift in how the internet could be used to create new forms of value, and how it could be used to enfranchise, and include people in global finance.
We've had the internet for years now, and on the internet, still nobody knows whether you're a dog or not. Identity fraud is completely out of control, data breach. So, the area where we need some new thinking is in the sort of in the identity space. So maybe the technology brings something new into that space. And we need it fairly quickly, because we haven't fixed the identity problem for people, but we're about to put 10 billion, trillion, gazillion things on the internet.
We can have a trust relationship without really having ever met each other or having done business at all with each other. I think that's fundamental, one of the fundamental things. Security is another. Blockchains are military-grade cryptology, and they've never been cracked. It isn't, when you hear about hackers, stealing Bitcoin or whatever, they're not stealing from the blockchain itself. They are stealing at the point of entry, at the wallet level or at the browser level, and they intercept those messages. But the blockchain itself is very secure.
The Internet of Things will probably be the best test case for a lot of blockchain technology. Because if we're going to have millions or billions or trillions of Internet-enabled devices doing everything from driving us around to managing our affairs to monitoring our health, they're going to need a way to move and store and manage value and data that has value in a way that's secure and private. And right now we don't have that. And I'm concerned about the ubiquity of data and how it flows in and through internet-connected devices. I think with a value platform like blockchain, we can at least address some of these problems and maybe even create new opportunities.
We cannot sit in our office and study and whatever. Of course, we do that as well, but we need to go out. We need to participate in this whole blockchain community. And honestly, what is very new to me, especially a younger person in my team, how enthusiastic they are about it. So if there is a hackathon, for example, organized, whatever, they never come to me and say, "Jan, can I go there? Can I get some money for that?" They just go. They're so interested. They just go and participate and share what they learned, and we have further discussion. And I believe this is really a new way also for us how we deal with this kind of new technology. We are really in the middle of it. Nobody tells us what to do. It's really we together shaping, let's say, what the ambition, what we stand for in the end for blockchain.
We need to be much more technological. We need to have an awareness of how something is programmed in order also to check if the programming is correctly or not. So these might be a kind of capabilities that at the moment we have, but not in the way that it's needed for the future. So I think in the future you always need to have a kind of IT or technological link to the things in order to understand them. Otherwise, you always need your IT guy sitting next to you, helping you in the understanding of the problem.
This is not something that's going to impact one or two industries. It's going to affect every industry in the same way that the internal combustion engine affected almost every industry, the same way the internet affected almost every industry, the way the steam engine created new industries. So this is one of those big generational technology shifts that will require a concerted and focused response. Otherwise, you'll miss the boat.
And I think we are all also in the financial service industry trying to recognize that we don't have to be defensive of that, but we rather have to embrace not just this technology, but this enabler that it brings us to actually access a vastly underutilized or undiscovered market that we have to really do business with on an eye-to-eye level.
We talk to all sorts of senior executives in financial services, and often we talk to them and they'd say, well, we've looked at Bitcoin, we've had smart people come in and explain to us how the blockchain works, but I still just really don't understand what it means for my business. And I think that makes sense in a way, because if you think about an iPhone, for example, what's really important when a new iPhone comes out? Is it that there's some new chipset, or they have some new way of compressing frequencies? I'm not an engineer. I don't know how any of that works. What matters to people is what they can do with the technology.
Of course, success is in no way guaranteed. One day we may look back on this and say, oh, wasn't that great? But if you ask me, I think there's undoubtedly a huge amount of progress that has already been made, and there's something here. I find it hard to believe that I'm going to look back in 10 or 20 years and say, oh, none of this ended up happening, because we're really seeing a new way of transacting value on the internet.
I know how big financial institutions work. First of all, they're not going to run out and do something reckless with technology. This is people's money and livelihood that they're working with, right? So these are slow upgrade processes. These systems, once they get implemented, will run in parallel with the old systems for a while before you have a switch over to the new one. That's standard in technology upgrades. So I knew this was going to take time. But yes, sure, there are antagonists. There are players who are threatened by their business model. It's the AT&T, Verizon, Kodak analogy again. Their business model is threatened by this. And of course, they're going to do things to try to slow down and water down the transformational networks that are being developed. And so there's a game theory approach to how the technology is being rolled out in the markets, for sure.
We made different roundtables here in Zug after the start of this Bitcoin experiment. And for example, we invited banks which are living here in Zug, people from Zug, bankers from Zug, and we tried to connect them with people of the Zug Crypto Valley. And they have been talking together, but these bankers were not so very happy. Okay, they said there are different things with law, and it's not so easy for us. But it's also a question of attitude. I think it's the same thing as for our city, for our administration. The banks have to get ready. And I know that in a way they are defensive, but on the other hand, they have, in research, they have made teams which face these questions. And maybe they are waiting a little bit now, but they can't deny it, I'm sure.
I think there's going to be a lot of disruption, a lot of revolution with respect to blockchain-based technologies. And what that's going to drive is not necessarily banks worrying about other banks being competitors. What banks worry about is the bank of one. The next generation of a banking network that's resident on a phone, that's decentralized, that's distributed, and is based on a digital token, a digital asset that's not necessarily issued by a bank or a government or anybody else. So it creates all these different permutations and opportunities, not only for enterprises and governments, but also for society.
We see a lot of examples of banks and consulting companies and other big four audit firms talking about how they can strip cost out of the business of, I don't know, trading in public markets or, whatever it might be. But if you take the example of public markets, how can you cut cost out of a market that doesn't exist in the future? What if the trading of securities happens peer-to-peer in the marketplace that doesn't have the traditional intermediaries of exchanges and brokers and agents and escrow agents and clearinghouses and all these other parties that we rely on? That's the cost you're cutting out, but what if the market can function without them? So the important thing for big leaders of big companies is not just to think about cost, but also to think strategically. What can this technology enable me to do that I wasn't able to do in the past?
I think it's going to take a long time for it to weave its way into the system. It may take a normal tech upgrade cycle for it to fully weave its way into the system, but I've said publicly, I think within 20 years that financial services will be just software. And the smart contracts technology in particular is going to automate a lot of the things that institutions and people handle today.
74% of the world's population, according to the World Bank, does not have access to basic financial services. In my home country, in the United States of America, which is one of the most wealthiest countries in the world, about 50% of the population does not have access to basic financial services, including bank accounts. There's a huge amount of people around the world that don't get to experience and be a part of the global economy because they don't have access to the financial system for a variety of reasons. I do think this technology will lift a lot of people out of poverty, but will also be an inclusive technology that allows more people to engage in global commerce.
I don't like to think that we're creating so much prosperity for the less than 1%. I like to think of purpose-led businesses. And by the way, that's the trick, I think, for large corporations, is to understand that the cost efficiencies of embracing this new technology will potentially widen their accessible markets at a cost that's reasonable. And that in itself will create prosperity in different areas. Something that I think we should think about.
Pretty soon, when smartphones can be had for less than $5 each, which is right around the corner, nearly every person living in poverty on Earth will have access to a smartphone and be connected to a network. That is game-changing in and of itself. When you have digital wallets on these phones and you have the ability to trade assets, we're going to answer that question, what happens when everybody has money? Because capitalism itself has thrived in some areas by the natural exclusion of others from markets. It actually uses that scarcity principle as its driving basis. So what happens when money is not scarce?
We will look at people and say, okay, what is the things that I cannot do and that we can, join forces. Much more than today, where we look at people and say, okay, how big is your car and how much money do you have on your bank account? So I believe that the future will be even more human or humane, than the last 100 years that we've seen.
So I don't think blockchain is a revolution. I think it has been done forever, like for 40 years, which is really forever in computer science in my domain. So both parts, both ingredients, the security and the distributed systems have been around since the 70s, basically, since the early 70s. And this is not a revolution. But the revolution, in some sense, or the evolution, is that that jobs will change. That's something I believe in, that jobs will be, digitized in some sense. Computers will do a lot of the manual labor that we still see in this kind of service domains today.
It's called the fourth technological revolution, and I think we are at the beginning of such a revolution just now, and that's why we don't close the eyes. And some people say, okay, there will be much trouble, people will lose their work and everything, jobless people, and I'm sure it will happen. But it's better we face it than we deny it.
Offshore working or automation or robots, are they threatening our work? And it's a real life question when your own son, who's prepared to go to get an advanced education, asking you that question. And I concluded that yes, I do have a genuine answer, that it's not threatening. It is forcing us to think a little bit different. But if we do it smarter, we actually give also the next generation a great new opportunity to actually reinvent why they get up every morning and why they go to work, and make sure they really make best use of the degree they studied for and the things they really want to do in life.
I want to make the world better. Just better. Okay, and whatever my measure of better is, or yours, is what might be valued by society. But the other thing is this wonderful opportunity to create a little bit of prosperity. Because what prosperity offers you is independence.
We don't have to have people who are living in squalor and simply, fighting for a handful of rice every day. There's too much. There's too much in the world to live like that anymore. And I think that certain countries, I think even certain corporations are beginning to understand that. And certainly this movement, this blockchain movement, is the technology underpinning, the technology part of that mindset which exists offline as well.
The idea is out, and if it's not being realized here, it may be realized there, or even in the internet, uncontrollable. So Bitcoin is here. Bitcoin is here to stay, and it will become bigger and bigger, as the blockchain, of course, as cryptocurrencies, as the possibilities which are connected to the blockchain and cryptocurrencies. That's out of the box. And the whole system does not need any government. It exists, it works. It's like a computer network surrounding the world. And you can say, okay, we don't want to be part of it. So be it. It's here, and it won't go away.
I feel like this is a generational opportunity for entrepreneurs and investors. And I quite frankly have not seen something as exciting in my entire investment career.
Let's try to build a new system that has better trade-offs, that has better features, that has less downsides. And let's make it work.
Now the pendulum's going to swing back. And what that's going to do is, frankly, make confidence in capital markets higher.
Blockchain has enormous potential implications outside of financial services. And we might even actually see the full-scale implementation of some of those more real-world applications leapfrog financial services.
This invention, when it came up in the 70s, this is really one of the totally groundbreaking ideas, right? It will change society for sure in many domains. It already has changed society in the sense that the internet is in some sense a secure place, that you can make transactions on the internet.
The potential for creating trust, or even permissionless trust, within the internet, that's something that we haven't had before. And so its impact on society, on business, on government, could be profound.
Blockchain is, to be fair, nearly 10 years old. But I think it's got another 10 years to run before we really see what its long-term impact is. I think it's going to be a long, much more steady journey that we go down. And you're going to see multiple technologies inspired by this thing.
Blockchain technology is not the solution to all the problems under the sun. And I think as it matures, we will begin to see its potential benefits, but also its limitations.
You can deny it or you can face it. And we always said we have to face it because these things are coming up if we want or not.
I've really seen very long-standing partners when they saw the whole opportunity really to change, to say, hey, I don't understand everything, but I understand there is something behind, so we need really to go forward. That's really great.
People often say that necessity is the mother of invention, but I like to say that necessity is also the mother of adoption. Because if there's a real use case that people, need a technology for, well, they'll start using it.
I started with Commodore, we had Atari, we had Apple. At some point in time, Windows came, and everybody just started to use Windows without asking what is the code behind it? What is the code behind moving the mouse?
We have a whole lot of possibilities. Everything will change. It's like, in my opinion, the possibilities are endless, and it reminds me a little bit of the situation as if we all of a sudden have two huge inventions or three inventions in one moment.
We actually are living a very interesting window of opportunity, and I'm surely very, very excited to fully embrace that. And even one little step can be a great step for mankind.
And I think that we are exiting the industrial age and that we are entering an age that we still have to name.
Where that will take us, I think, is very hard to tell at this point, but my suspicion is it means a sort of resurgence of the notion of community.
It absolutely feels like a whole new paradigm for changing the world.
Yeah, we're at a crossroads. We're at a crossroads here. We have the wherewithal now to create technology that would actually help the entire human race. The question is, will we do it? But we can do it now.
There's so much innovation that blockchain technology has spurred all throughout the world, and I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that this technology is going to affect everybody. I would say in 10-20 years time frame, there won't be a human being whose life is not impacted by this technology.
Is Bitcoin the currency of the future, or is it the payment system they're developing?
Bingo! It's the payment system. It's the blockchain encryption, and they're interesting things. I think Bitcoin, or the really blockchain encryption that's behind it, has a greater ability to bring more of the world's population out of poverty than anything we've seen in...
Well, for one thing, it's a cheap payment system.
For one thing, it's a cheap payment system, but it's more important than that. It's more important than that. Blockchain cryptography is all about digital transfer of ownership in a completely transparent and public way. Okay, I don't want to go into any of the math and the complexity behind it, but think of what that means. That means that I can actually record ownership in public in a digital means. 50% of the world's population has a mobile phone. I read an estimate this month that in 2020, 90% of the world's population will have mobile phones. That's probably a high estimate, but that's okay. Now,
$35 smartphones.
But we're throwing them away, and they can ship them off to emerging markets. But what's powerful about this, now think about Hernando de Soto.
Yes.
Okay. The Institute for Liberty and Democracy in Peru. I really think Hernando de Soto should win the Nobel Prize for the work he's done. I hope he does. But he's gone around the world and identified one of the most powerful things to the economy and the creation of wealth, and that is the ownership of property.
Which you can then use as collateral.
Which you can use as collateral, and when you own it, you will develop it. You will. The best thing you can do for the environment is to own it, because when you own it, you make sure it's sustainable for your future family, and that's powerful. But they don't have the ability to own it. If you live in a shanty town, you operate outside of the legal economy. It's not that you want to operate outside of the legal economy, but you have no ownership of any property.
Although in the neighborhood, everyone knows who owns what.
And once you introduce blockchain cryptography, guess what they can do? Have a public ledger of ownership and transfer that cannot be denied because it's absolutely transparent. It's absolutely transparent. It is the means through which these individuals can get exactly what Hernando de Soto thinks they best need to bring themselves out of poverty. It is so much more profound than that, but at its very basis, it has the ability to give these individuals the right of ownership to property. And that has more than anything else the ability to bring them out of poverty. And I can't wait. It'll be adopted elsewhere. I mean, it's such a powerful, blockchain encryption is such a powerful tool. It'll be used by banks, it'll be used by credit card companies. It will become a standard. But what's more interesting is what it can do to poverty around the world, to eliminate poverty.
But also, what does that mean, that technology mean for credit card companies and the whole payment system, crazy gobbledygook payment system we have today? Very expensive. Doesn't that blow it away?
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, think about it. When there was one manufacturer of phones in the U.S., the U.S. government, what did we have? This big clunky rotary thing that sat on desks. Now, what do we have? Cell phones of all flavors, sizes. I can sit in Africa and on my cell phone take courses at MIT because they're public record. It's absolutely astounding what happens when you can actually innovate around the world and compete. And what is happening is blockchain cryptography, forget Bitcoin, creates a competitive technology, a competitive innovation that these credit card companies will have to adopt. The ones that adopt it first will bring their cost base down. And importantly, if you think about a retail store, and I have this with my kids. My kids are off in college and they go to a retail store, they use their credit card. And the credit card company
costs the retailer 3 to 6.
Right, because they reject the well, first the fee is high, and then they reject the transaction. Because why is this card suddenly showing up in some city, some place where I don't live? So it gets cut off. Well, with blockchain cryptography, the buyer and the seller automatically trust each other over an untrusted network. That's what's so powerful about it. A blockchain-based transaction is verified within 10 minutes. It's not verified within 10 minutes for a credit card, which is why 5 to 10% of all transactions are rejected on the spot. It's not verified until often days later. Even a check is not verified for days. And that is completely taken out of the system. So on day one, the retailer's sales go up because they don't have to reject the transaction and they save on the fees. It doesn't really get much better than that if you're looking for a disruptive innovation in any single industry. It's wonderful.
We now have available this through the magic of Skype. Patrick Byrne, I think a gentleman, he needs little introduction to many of you, but for those who are not as familiar, I'll very briefly, without embarrassing him, talk about a little bit of his background. He is a Wall Street slayer of sorts. He has gone to bat against some of the nefarious interests in Wall Street and put some of his own skin in the game in that aspect. He not only holds degrees from, tell me if I'm right here, Patrick, from Dartmouth, from Cambridge, and from Stanford. Despite all of that, he came out on the other side just fine. He is, of course, an internet entrepreneur, and I'm sure many of you, my wife in particular, are available with Overstock.com and all of its many offerings for the house. But most importantly for our conversation today, he is an early adopter like Caitlin Long, an innovator in the blockchain and Bitcoin space, And again, when we talk about skin in the game, putting his own skin in the game to create, this term went around earlier today, a nascent company which will allow blockchain technology to make property titles far more dependable and useful all around the world. So that said, please give a big round of applause and welcome to Patrick Byrne.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's a great honor to speak with you and the Mises Institute once again. Okay, this is Wired Magazine has me Bitcoin Messiah, and as you've actually already heard, Scourge of Wall Street. I have something else going for me. I'd like to think that we have a solution to global poverty. It's based on an insight of an economist named Hernando de Soto, a Peruvian. This is his great insight. 7.5 billion people on Earth, 2/3 of them do not live in the world as we know it, no formal property rights. So the point is they do own assets, but 2/3 of the world keep their assets in informal ledgers, not in formal land registries as we know them. And because of that, there's a market opportunity for businesses like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and FARC and so forth. Because what they do, because these people do not have records to their lands, there's all kinds of things that you and I can do that they can't do, such as what you see on your screen. If they try to get, and so if somebody's living in, say, a favela on a hillside outside Rio de Janeiro, they may have lived there for 4 generations. They don't have any piece of paper that says they own that house they live in, but, because they don't have the piece of paper, of course, they never know if the local generalissimo shows up and says, Senor, that's not your land, that was my grandfather's land, and you must leave tomorrow. And so you don't have any incentive to invest. You don't have any piece of paper you can go and borrow some money against, start a fruit stand, start a business. If they try to get formal property rights, it may take 30 years and 200 steps, which means 200 bribes to 200 petty bureaucrats. It's not feasible. This has led to a lot of problems. Here's one. Groups like Shining Path, FARC, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, what they do is they roll into a town. They're actually quite well organized, ISIS in particular. They would go into a town and have DMV on a laptop, and they'd have people go around that look at land titles and say, oh, let's see the land title, your certificate to this home you live in. And if you have and you may have some informal little certificate of occupancy from a municipal authority or something, they say, well, do you support ISIS? We'll put our stamp on it. And so they get people to support ISIS and they put their chop on it. That's really the business they're in. They're selling protection, a little bit like I happen to be in New York in the moment. And I have a friend who's an entrepreneur here. And she said she was a small restaurant owner. And a few days after she started her business many years ago, a couple rough-looking characters show up and say, oh, beautiful restaurant. Boy, it would be shame if anything happened to this. Let me, do something nice for us, and it won't. And she didn't. 3 days later, she came in, and the whole front of the restaurant was covered in black paint. It's a protection racket. That's really the business that the terrorist groups are in, fundamentally. It also leads to, it's led to the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, 64 people, starting with a guy named Wazouzi in Tunisia, set themselves on fire. Of the 64, about 35 lived. Hernando de Soto went around and interviewed. About 18 of them he was able to find. Not a single one of them was an Allahu Akbar kind of guy. They were all little entrepreneurs. Guy with a fruit stand, Wazouzi in Tunisia was a guy with a fruit stand that he'd been selling for years out of one spot in the city market. Nothing's licensed. It's all convention. One day a cop, a female police woman, shows up and slaps him and makes him leave. And he set himself on fire. And that began the Arab Spring that took down all these countries. Well, it turns out it was really a revolution of the merchants. It was a revolution that's not specific. It's a revolution of the untitled entrepreneurs. And they were tired of getting their stuff expropriated. And that was the word they used all the time, by the way. They often decried how their capital had been expropriated. These guys there's all kinds of cell phone videos of the guys who set themselves on fire. And they said things like that. It's amazing. I shouldn't laugh, but it's odd. It's odd. They're capitalists who were objecting that their capital had been expropriated. They're objecting to no rule of law. Environmental damage, commons, results. This has been a result. People switch sides. In other words, when poor people get their their informal property turned into legal property, they have a stake in the system. They switch sides. Entrepreneurship starts. This has happened a couple times. In Peru, Hernando de Soto had this theory that they could do this. In 1990, for you youngsters out there, there was a movement in Peru called Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path. It was a Maoist group, very much like the Khmer Rouge. They scalped people, killed about 70,000 people. And they had 60% of the country. Peru was lost. Peru, Eagleberger, our Secretary of State, said it was the biggest problem in the Western Hemisphere, biggest security threat. Hernando got the U.S. and government of Peru and with the U.S. backing to go out, and they went out to, he calls it the Indiana Jones phase of his life. They would go out to these little villages and creeks and get the books of documents, bring them back to Lima, turn them into real documents, bring them back to the people, give it to them. Everybody switched sides. Within 6 months, this group that had won 60% of the country collapsed, and everybody had to turn themselves in for protection. Otherwise, the people would have lynched them. It's really the last time the West won a war against terrorism, actually. It led to something of a miracle. Peru's done very well. I know that a lot of we Misesians like to talk about Chile. Peru's really done very well in the 28 years since then. Lots of small businesses started up, etc. It's a real gem. Incidentally, this is what we did in Japan after World War II. They had all these feudal ledgers. That is how feudalism worked. And MacArthur went and made it all get turned into real law, real legal system. And we know what happened. So now the problem has been, Hernando wrote his book in 2000, The Mystery of Capital, Why Capitalism Worked in the West and Fails Everywhere Else. It was never really possible to implement it, though. However, now, due to the magic of things like Facebook and blockchain and digital marketing and mobile apps, it is possible to bring that to the world. I know a place that's really good at blockchain and digital media and mobile apps. It's Overstock.com. We've won, all kinds of awards for our technology. Hernando and I have gotten together, formed a company, and we have built an app that lets his thinking finally get implemented. See, that's really always been the take. Great in theory, never got implemented. And his theory was that the West instead should be helping developing countries just build land titling systems. And if you did that, it would unleash far more capital than the West has ever given the developing world in terms of aid and such. It would just get unleashed if we helped them get land titling. But there have been different World Bank projects to try to make it happen. You really can't. But now through the combination of these technologies and about $20 million, we think we can make this happen globally. I think it's really a civilizational moment. So we've been working on this for some time, and I actually expect to have a prototype in the marketplace this summer. I won't name the country, but there is a country, and we're going to get it tuned in right there. And then there's whole continents reaching out that say, will you fly here? When can you get this? I'm saying, let us just get the thing built. But anyway, it's blockchain based. See, the whole thing it's really all about the trust aspect. People will always say, well, why couldn't you do that with a database? When you get into blockchain, every time you get talking about a business, people say, who are against blockchain, say, well, why couldn't you have just done that with a database? It's like they miss the point. We want systems where there's not a single point of trust, where there's nothing you got to trust, no corporation you have to trust, no government you have to trust. That's what blockchain lets us do. In crypto, we trust. Let me play.
There are additional regulatory changes that this breakdown of the central pillar of competitive markets requires in order to return to stability. particularly in the areas of fraud, settlement, and securitization?
Okay, so Alan Greenspan, he referred to settlement. When Wall Street collapsed in 2008, Alan Greenspan went before Congress and identified it correctly as a settlement crisis. This is what he meant by settlement. When grandpa is buying stock from a hedge fund, brokers are communicating. And the act of them exchanging stock and cash is settlement. And actually, when I was a kid, this happened on bicycle. Wall Street was filled with guys on bicycles running around with sacks of stock over their shoulders, and they were delivering among the brokers. That's how settlement worked. However, in the 1960s, volume on Wall Street quadrupled, and the guys on the bicycles logjammed. Wall Street was there was a period that only the real old timers would remember called the Great Wall Street Paperwork Crisis. Wall Street was only open Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday for a few hours a day. They were trying to give a chance for the guys on bicycles to get caught up. And it's something like a database. If a database gets log jammed and how that ripples out, that happened. It took down some brokerages. It took down a large brokerage actually in America, this database ripple at the center of our capital market. So the SEC called the industry together and they proposed a solution. Well, there were two solutions proposed actually. One was, let's have a peer-to-peer electronic settlement system. The other solution was called central counterparty clearing. And that's where there's just one counterparty to every broker in the market. And all we have to worry about is settlement between that counterparty and every broker. They created a vault, a depository under Wall Street called Sindre & Company. Now, this is what's funny. If I were in the room, I would ask you, raise your hand if you own any public stock. And about half the people in the room will put your hand up. And then I would tell you that everyone with your hand up is incorrect. Nobody in the room owns any public stock. Nobody in the room owns any stock in any public company. All the stock in the world, all the stock in every American publicly traded company is owned by a company you never heard of. It's called Sindre & Company. It's in New Jersey. And I'm not just talking about they warehouse or they store the stock. They have the legal ownership to all of America, all of corporate America. What they do is they have generated what are basically in casino land, it'd be called a marker. They've generated chits, IOUs, contractual claims against those shares called share entitlements. When you're trading stock, all that's really going on is these contractual claims against that stock are swirling around among different parties. All the stock, both the location and the legal ownership, is staying with a corporation no one's ever heard of. Literally, 98% of the stock of corporate America, publicly traded corporate America, is legally owned by an entity that no one's ever heard of. And all the rest of us have are strings or daisy chains of contractual right. If you're, say, in the lower left-hand corner, that's your broker. And that broker clears through a broker who clears through another broker who's cleared to the DTCC. And I'm on, say, the lower right-hand corner. If I sell you 100 shares of IBM and you buy 100 shares of IBM, all that's really happening is these different contractual claims are shifting around among parties, and everything gets netted and pre-netted and such, has nothing to do with any actual property right. What could possibly go wrong? What could go wrong is that can log jam, and that's what happened in 2008. And it's sort of this thing that there's a reason Alan Greenspan was talking about it on October 23rd, 2008. So our system log jammed, and it log jammed because all you really own when you think you own 100 shares of IBM is you have a contractual claim against a broker who has a contractual claim against another broker, who has a contractual claim against another broker, who has a contractual claim against the DTCC, who has a contractual claim against Sindre & Company, who actually owns the stock. And there's nothing that says those have to be a one-to-one relationship. So what it is fractional reserve banking without a reserve requirement. And it allows for all kinds of mischief I won't go into. The whole thing, the point is, this is Wall Street as we know it. That can all be, and it didn't come out of a burning bush. It's stuff that was created in the 70s. And it's not like anyone was necessarily evil to do it. The technology of peer-to-peer settlement wasn't ready, is what they decided. So they went with this system, which had been tried in Vienna in the 1860s. In 1986, the SEC hired, I think it was a retired judge, to look at it all, a guy named Pollock. And he studied this, and he wrote a very disturbing report talking about how bad this was for all kinds of reasons. It could lead to systemic collapse, which is what happened in 2008. And it could lead to, there's different opportunities for mischief. And if you heard about a fight I had 12 years ago with Wall Street, that's what it was about. It wasn't about overstock, it was about, I realized that there were huge opportunities for mischief in this system, and including the possibility of a systemic collapse. So that's why Greenspan was saying that. Let's go back to the idea of settlement using a ledger. This ledger is magic. It's cryptographically protected. It's public, transparent. There's copies of it everywhere. We could make money just exist as entries within that ledger. And the cash component of settling, say, grandpa buys a baseball glove from the guy on the right, is just some entries in a ledger. That's the concept, of course, behind Bitcoin. You can apply it to Wall Street by adding entries for coins for stocks. And as people buy and sell stock, it's just entries in that cryptographic magic ledger. You could take this whole meshigas and replace it. Seems simple. Seems simple. That's what I've spent the last 4 years and about $75 million working on. It's called T0. And that's what we're doing in the stock market. Okay, I'm going to stop there and so that's how, two examples of how we can use blockchain to address poverty and mischief, poverty and global poverty and mischief in Wall Street. Let's go to questions.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, since you were one of the first global retailers to accept crypto, what do you think is holding back the rest of the world and large retailers from accepting crypto, and what will it take to get them to start accepting the way Overstock has?
Actually, let me correct you. We were the first global retailer. In fact, when there was the largest company in the world, someone ought to check this, the largest company in the world accepting Bitcoin on December 31st, 2013, was, my understanding is, it was an $800,000 a year diner in Australia. We stepped in and started taking it. We were $1.3 billion. So we like to think we saved the movement. You know, it would have taken a year or two to get to someone doing 10 million, then a year or two, someone 100. Yeah. So maybe we like to save it 5 or 6 million. We're probably giving ourselves too much credit. Why have not more people done it? You know, it still has a stigma attached to it. I still get asked about ecstasy dealing and gun running and money laundering. It's got that. But, you know, it really is, there isn't on the demand side. That's really the answer. Only about 0.2% of our sales are in crypto. Maybe half of that or 3/4 of that Bitcoin, and the other little stub in other altcoins. So people, and I've said that publicly. So the fact that only 0.2% of our sales are in Bitcoin maybe tells people, it's not worth integrating. It's not worth all the trouble and reputational cost.
I've got a question. Thank you very much for that presentation, and it's very encouraging to hear the way you jumped in and actually changed the trend of the market. It also suggests that with your heft, perhaps you've got insights into what the next tipping point might be to actually make it more mainstream. Your thoughts?
Well, it still is not really integrated in many places. It's a little bit like getting adoption on Apple Pay or something. So we're going to do more. You're going to start seeing us do more. Actually, at the beginning of June, we're introducing an alpha project that will do more to make us, help us spread crypto. We want to create economic incentives. You know, it's kind of funny. People don't, I think everyone has an economic incentive. It's an insurance policy. Because if all the systems as they exist, these crazy Keynesian magic money tree, multiplier effect, magic money tree ever comes crashing down, The goal is to have this robust set of alternative institutions that'll survive. And I feel like I'm in a race against time, building capital markets, building central banking, blockchain central banking, blockchain capital markets, et cetera. So everybody, but you have to create an incentive for people to do it. What happens is when countries, I was just in a pretty lousy country, I won't say its name, and everybody is like rushing to crypto. Everybody's in on crypto. It happened in Greece. It happened in Cyprus. That's really what happens. Is when people wait. They don't buy their insurance policy until they read about the hurricane coming. So I think at the end of the day, what's going on in countries is as they start going pear-shaped, their economies, you have people turn to crypto. If you have any ideas on how do you think we can get that to be accelerated in the United States and not wait till our dollar crisis?
Yes, Patrick, a question. What is your opinion on the deep state's reaction to you, and whether or not you think that if this threatens the basic military industrial complex structure in the American economy, how is that going to affect the progress that you're attempting to make?
It's a good question. I think that the U.S. government has an ambivalent attitude towards it. I think maybe it's the case that if the powers that be had it to do again, and they could go back 7 years in time, they would go back and make all of this illegal. All of this, everything cryptographic, just make it illegal. It's too late now. It's in it's all out in the world on white papers. Any math department at any graduate math department in any university in the world can recreate it all. So it can't be stopped. And there are people here who get it. There are people here who don't. People who care about systemic risk, in my experience, no matter which institution they're in, they like it. People who are, even a lot of regulators like it. They get it's going to make their job a lot easier. The beautiful thing about that capital market I showed you, all kinds of mischief that goes on Wall Street can't even go on in a blockchain capital market. That's the funniest thing. It can't go on because the original sin, as by the way, you just had Caitlin Long speak. She's one of the great minds in this field. And her point is that's the original sin. When you separate, when you shave the property rights off. It's only when you do that all kinds of mischief can happen. By reuniting the trading with the settlement, it actually makes a whole bunch of mischief impossible. So there's regulators who see that too, and there's politicians who see that. People I think they're torn between two things here. They fear it because they think it is going to disrupt the world as they know it, and it will. I'll get back to that. But on the other hand, they don't want to fall behind. When Clinton did something smart, when the internet came along, Bill Clinton, a lot of hands here wanted to regulate it. Clinton stood up against the Democrats and did not regulate it because he knew if he did, China or Russia or someone else would become the boss of it. That's one of the directions things are pulled here in DC, and that has been amplified by the fact that China came out 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, with their newest 5-year plan. And in their newest 5-year plan, they named 3 or 4 technologies they want to dominate the world. And at the end of this 5 years, blockchain is the first of them. So I think once the U.S. saw that, the politicians saw that, and the regulators and stuff, everybody's scared to death of stopping it. Actually, I'll be honest. I mean, I've never said a nice thing about DC in my life, but I do have to say what I've seen in the last 6 months to a year is very good and encouraging and professional. People, it's almost, so I've met with different people, and some of it's in the newspapers. I'm not going to go through it, but I've met with different people, some under duress and some not. I've had lots of conversations. It seems to me Washington wants to play, what they say anyway, is they want to play a constructive role and don't want it to be able to help terrorism. And so they want to make sure their AML, KYC instincts are assuaged, and that's their prerogative. I know that would bother some libertarians, but they do have terrorism to worry about. So anyway, that's how I'm not sure that. So the deep state, I think, is afraid to stop this because if they stop it, China gets it all. That's what's crazy. China's right out there on our tail. They are building all these systems too. Even though they're locking it down in China and they've made it illegal, they made mining illegal. So the only people mining in China are the people really connected to the government in some way and have government connections. And I mean, different ways people are finding around the rules. But basically, they're cracking down in China on Bitcoin, but they want to be masters of blockchain technology. They're creating things to distribute around the world. And if the Chinese get it, you know, we can live with maybe with Chinese, everything running on Chinese transistors. We don't want, or chips or something. We don't want any authoritarian government to have control of the underlying technology of blockchain. And if the U.S. backs off this, it becomes a Chinese world. Everyone starts learning Chinese because it'll be a Chinese world. Because the Chinese will conquer the world with blockchain if the U.S. government tries to slow it down here. Sad to say, I'm not in favor of that.
I have a question that with deflation, there's one of the problems with deflation, which I think is somewhat natural, is that there's a liquidity problem. So, for example, if I can use $1 US to buy a car, how do I buy a cup of coffee? But with something like blockchain or Bitcoin, it's infinitely divisible. So gold isn't. If you keep dividing gold, essentially the molecule is no longer gold. But with a blockchain or with something that is structured like Bitcoin is, I could buy a cup of coffee with like 1/1000th of a Bitcoin eventually. So there's never the excuse to inflate the currency for the purpose of liquidity. And I've never heard anybody talk about that, and I'm wondering if somebody has and if there's something I can read about that. But I think that's one of the really attractive things to me.
Interesting. Well, Bitcoin actually does have some limit. It goes out, I think it's 8 digits. So what would that be? 100 million. I think it breaks up into 100 million cents, one Bitcoin. But of course, that's not fixed. If they had to, they could take it out further. People have been attracted to the deflationary aspect of Bitcoin. I think there's more deflation than probably Satoshi planned on, frankly. There's something called bit rot, which is, some number of people every day who own Bitcoin get sick or die or lose a key or get disinterested in Bitcoin or whatever, or get Alzheimer's and they don't remember their key. And for that reason, there is coinage that is just rotting. And so there's probably a bit higher factor of deflation within Bitcoin than had originally been planned, incidentally. I don't know, I forget what the number is offhand, but the calculations show it may actually be a sharply deflationary, or, it's not insignificant. Other than that, no, but you ought to look up, see how many digits Bitcoin breaks into. And so I don't think that is the case that we're infinite, by the way. But next question.
2 quick questions. First of all, what should we do with our stock, those of us who own stock? And the second one is, I understand how Bitcoin is secured, because you got these miners that are going to make a lot of money either by getting a new coin or by charging to put a block, put the transactions in a block. But how do all these other chains encourage people to make nodes and to secure the network, especially your property title system?
Well, different systems for different coins. People have different theories, and some of them are private ledgers where there's a private corporation which does maintain the system. There's different models, proof of work, proof of stake. I'll mention one that is of great interest to me, and I'm just now have been given permission to talk about it. It's called Raven Coin. Raven as in Edgar Allan Poe, the Raven. It is an open source project that launched on January 3rd. Actually, it launched on October 31st, and the Genesis block was mined on January 3rd. Those are the dates that Satoshi himself chose. So no one can complain. Pre-mining and there's all kinds of mischief that can go on our field too. But by keeping to Satoshi's dates and such, there's no pre-mining. It was an adequate amount of time. It has spread faster in terms of number of nodes, far faster than anything in history. I think it may already be in the top 10 in hashing power. I heard like number 6 or something. It's only 3 or 4 months old. I don't know if that sounds, I don't know. Don't quote me on that, but it is up to 12,000 nodes. It's a fork or an evolution of Bitcoin, but it's 10 times more informational efficient. There's 10 times, the blocks are 10 times bigger, and the energy is 1,000 times more. And it's trading at 4 cents a coin now. You can either, and what's very interesting about it, but if I make you rich on this, remember this moment. This is 4 cents a coin now. There's an argument it's better than Bitcoin or Ethereum. It's called Raven Coin. Once again, it's very interesting because it's ASICs resistant. You know, there's CPUs, GPUs, and ASICs. And ASICs are chips with dedicated circuits dedicated to one algorithm. Well, the algorithm, the mathematical question that runs underneath Bitcoin, people built ASICs chips for, and they're so much more efficient than that. They dominate. Everyone mining Bitcoin uses these rigs. Well, Raven Coin runs on 16 different math problems, and those math problems vary randomly, and you need the answer to one problem to start the next problem. Because of that, you can't make an ASICs chip. I think the most circuits anyone ever put on an ASICs chip is 3, maybe 4. You couldn't put 16 circuits on. So there's no way to do this with an ASICs chip. Because of that, it means you don't have a disadvantage to be back just on your GPUs. That fact is, there's some very interesting, this Raven coin, and I know one of the big thinkers who was part of the movement. He's a tricky guy. Clever guy, and this kind of hacks. This is a hack, but not a hack. I mean, a metaphorical hack. They've kind of hacked through a bunch of the problems around the crypto community. Take a look into something called Raven Coin.
Patrick, Steve Sadler, a quick question for you. As you look at your T0 platform, and I guess we went through a couple years ago the Regulation A hopefulness, where we thought capital markets would be more free and open to smaller companies raising capital. How do you see the T0 ICO opportunity, and then what's your view on, let's call it, the regulatory overlords stepping in to kibosh?
Well, let me take those. Let me reverse those. Here's the regulatory situation. I'm going to shock you because while a libertarian, I'm a small L libertarian. I don't think we want to be too ideological. And here's one example. We used to live in a country where people drove around with a suitcase full of stock certificates, penny stock flim-flam, and they would stop at some farm. Guy stops at some farm and swindles a widow out of her farm in return for some phony stock certificates. So in 1933, we passed these laws that say if you're raising money from the public, you have to do things. You have to you got to write a prospectus. Lawyers and accountants have to check it all out and certify. The government has to look at it and say, yes, this prospectus fairly describes this business, and then you take this and you give it to the public and you sell in stock and you raise capital. Now, a libertarian is going to say, why, that's Big Brother or that's paternalism. Why does the government get to do that? I'll just tell you that before we had this system, everyone was getting swindled all the time. And now maybe it'd be better to have that than to have the mayor planting a sign saying beach is safe for swimming when in fact it isn't safe for swimming. I don't know. But if I can tell you, I'm as libertarian as the next guy, and we like to think that the invisible hand will take care of things. But the truth is the financial industry draws more than its fair share of swindlers. That's because the nature of every financial business is give me money now, I'll do something in the future. So anyway, so that's the rule. I thought that by a year ago, people were going to be all over the idea of using blockchain coins to do shares of stock. But a year ago, this thing happened instead, the ICO movement, initial coin offering, which is selling utility tokens. It was people going out and raising money from the public for a business idea and really distorting it and saying there's ways you could reframe this business idea. And I'm going to walk you through an example because this is actually quite important in terms of understanding what's going on now. If I come to your town and say, I'm going to set up a video or game parlor, and I've got this parlor, and I've put in 20 video games, and I've got 1 million of those little brass tokens you buy, and I'll sell them to you in town for 700,000. And I'm doing that to sort of get people interested and get you coming in with your tokens and using my video games, and maybe we'll prime the pump. That's just a pre-sale of those tokens. It's okay, I'm going to sell you these $1 million worth of tokens. I'll take your $700,000, and then I'm going to go out with the $700,000 and buy a bunch of video games and find a place to put them, and I'll open a store. At some point, that's it. You're really buying those on an expectation of some future benefit. And back on July 25th of last year, the SEC, in my view, correctly said that's a security. If you do that, and they were ruling on the Dow token, they said that's the security. The fact that you're not able to use the tokens today, you're able to use them in the future, that makes it a security. And so what people were doing last year felt to me like they drove down a cul-de-sac. They went into this cul-de-sac called ICOs. Instead of using blockchain to do securities, they said, we're going to come up with these business models where we can kind of say, we're selling these tokens that you're going to be able to use in video games in the future. And that's how we're going to capitalize our business. So that's not a security. We're just pre-selling tokens. That's what the SEC came in on July 25th and said, with regard to one company that was over the line. In December, they did another company. And then just a couple months ago, the SEC chairman, Clayton, came out and said something funny, like the truth is every security token I've ever seen, every utility token I've ever seen is really a security. Meaning all 1,000 of those that came out last year broke the law. They were out there raising money from the public, and they were ignoring all those laws about 19 from 33 and 34. I don't know what's going to happen with them. However, I believe that means you're nuts. If you're nuts if you violate those laws, by the way, because what they do, if you raise money from the public and you don't follow the rules, you take that money, you build a successful business. 20 years later, they can show up and take your business and just unwind the whole thing. They unwind it all, and they find the original people and get them money back. Believe it or not, they do that. So it doesn't matter if your business works or not. You're nuts if you violate that law. And all these 1,000 businesses or more which raised all this capital, I think they're kidding themselves if they think they're not going to have trouble in the future. It can happen 20 years down the road. So, however, it's undeniable. Bob Greifeld, the retired chairman and CEO of NASDAQ, came out in November and said 100% of the stocks and bonds being sold on Wall Street today could be tokenized. And in 5 years, 100% of the stocks and bonds on Wall Street will be tokenized. That's saying that the plumbing of Wall Street is going to be deprecated over the next 5 years. All that crazy red cloud that I was showing you is going to go away, and it's going to be replaced by blockchain. I mean, that's what he was saying. The chairman of NASDAQ, the retired chairman of NASDAQ, that's what he was saying. And I hope he's right, because what we've done is we built the replacement. And I think the SEC is okay with this. I mean, I'm sorry. I should say I'm under SEC investigation. I think this is investigation number 7 and in my life. And I expected it that when we started, building a whole alternative Wall Street, they would show up and want to know about it. So, and they've made clear to me that the only thing they said when you're under SEC investigation is, I'm under SEC investigation. I'm under federal investigation. It's the 7th time in my life I can say that, by the way. Okay, next question.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for speaking with us. And number 7 is lucky, so I hope that one goes well for you. Both from your speech and from Caitlin's speech, we've all learned that we're crazy to invest in Wall Street. That being said, however, should we be investing in Overstock.com or other companies? And is the developmental work you're doing with blockchain utilities something that is associated with Overstock or with a different company? And are there, I guess one final question, are there other companies in the blockchain space that you think are worthy of investing in for those of us crazy enough?
I certainly cannot comment on should you invest or not invest in Overstock. I've already got enough headaches with Washington without that. All the blockchain stuff we are doing is within Overstock. It's and it owns this blockchain. It's Medici, and Medici has 12 investments in blockchain. Just one of them is T0. So there's some other very exciting ones in there. There's also 65 million or 70 million Raven coins. It's pretty interesting. Which is in the notes. It's out there in the public. Nobody's figured out, and that only has a few $1 million of value now. Who knows if it ever does more. So, but anyway, everything I've described to you is within Overstock. Yes.
Patrick, Hunter Hastings here. You said at the beginning that this could be a civilizational moment, and you talked about, with Dr. DeSoto, eliminating terrorism through blockchain entrepreneurship. Could you say a little bit more about your vision for the civilization effect of blockchain?
Sure. Here's the deep meaning, I think. For 6,000 years, as we go about consensual exchange, have had this problem to solve of trust. You can't trust me. If I don't know you and you don't know me, we can't trust each other. So I go to buy a camel from you and I'm going to give you this gold coin. You don't know if you can trust me. Did I debase the coin or not? So we create an institution like a mint, and who has monopoly on violence in an oasis, puts his face on the coins and says, anyone who debases this, I kill. That's a way that's a business model, a way to monetize his monopoly on violence. But it's an institution that creates trust so you and I can go about our camel for gold coin exchange. Same thing with land titling. We can't trust each other, but there's one office, the land titling office. So when you buy a piece of land from me and I give you that piece of paper and it gets registered there, it's trustworthy. 5 years ago, I was in a company in Silicon Valley that had 160 industries written on a wall that really had that same common denominator, or I'd say functions or institutions in society that have that common denominator. They're there to inject trust so strangers can conduct exchange. Well, for 6,000 years, we accumulated those institutions like barnacles. And depending on the country and the time, some of those institutions are government and some are private. But they all have that they have this common denominator. Now, though, we can achieve that trust between parties using cryptography, using tokenization and cryptography. Exchange becomes totally trustworthy, which means we have turned in, it's like becoming a buggy whip manufacturer. We have made into buggy whip manufacturers all those 160 institutions that accumulated over 6,000 years. And I mean from notary public to even tax collector to Visa card, et cetera, et cetera. We've made cryptography properly lined up with tokens and such. All this crypto stuff means we can achieve that without those institutions. Well, here's the funny part. If you're a liberal, a philosophical liberal, you remember that those institutions, we don't live to serve them. They're just things we created so we could go about our pursuits of life, liberty, property, happiness. We created them, and now we don't need them. So it's going to be a really funny time, because what the internet did to publishing, I think crypto is going to do to 160 institutions that we accumulated over 6,000 years. In fact, I think it's so big, I actually worry. I worry about the story of Frankenstein. Remember, Frankenstein wasn't the monster. The monster was the monster. Frankenstein was the doctor who was so enamored, the young scientist so crazy about what he could do with science that he didn't give any thought to the ramifications. Well, civilization as we know it has grown up and around these 100+ institutions, that they're the glue that bind everything together and make it work. Blockchain is like a corrosive acid to that glue. We don't need them. And I'm an incrementalist. I want to see it unwind slowly because I think lots of bad things happen when things snap.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I had a question on the, let's just take an example of the solution to poverty that you're working towards. Let's say that we do get titling of, say, land, farms in, say, Tanzania or South Africa or something like that. And now we have, the title cannot be corrupted or changed through a corrupt government official or something like that. And now we have a worldwide network where that title can be used as collateral to provide that someone can borrow against and things like that. But my question is, it seems like there's kind of a missing link where if you don't have a good, police force or what you want to call it on the ground, that when, say that the loan is not repaid and I need to collect that collateral, I can't actually get it because there's a new gang in town that says, well, actually that title is not valid here. It's not worth anything. How do you kind of move from that technology, the good blockchain technology, to the actual boots on the ground that might make that contract enforceable?
Well, we do want, at some point, the informal ledgers, which we surface using this technology, to be recognized by government. In some cases, that's going to be us hiring law firms in the country and fighting and demonstrating that what we have surfaced meets. And by the way, before anyone can dig, before a Western company can go and do business and dig a hole in the ground somewhere, since 1940, there have been laws in the US and Canada, this whole string, by international treaty, by national, by local, boom, boom. So part of our work is going to be surfacing these and representing and getting government to acknowledge. But we think it's going to come as much from that governments are going to cooperate with us. We can do this without them. But we think if we go to the government of a country in the Middle East with 40 million people and say, we can show you where 15 million people, if you will title them, we can surface where 15 million people live, and they will register their land and start paying tax and so on and so forth if you will commit to titling them. Hernando de Soto can do that. 10 million people in Peru have title to land because of what he did for them back then. So we think we can do that. And in fact, I got to tell you, the organizations that are calling me and asking me to come and do this in their countries convinced me that we're not going to have that big a problem. Maybe we will, and we'll have to hire a bunch of law firms in different countries and fight. But the point is, it's almost like being a union leader. I used to work for Buffett. And when I worked for Buffett, I ran a group of companies that were in a union fight. And I learned the union model. And the union model is kind of interesting. You hire, some college kids for next to nothing, and you get them to live in a crummy motel in Odessa, Texas for 6 weeks, and get folks in some 500, 800 person plant to sign a card, and you turn them into a union. You're going to start collecting about $1 million a year from them. About every 3 or 4 years, you have to send a suit down to renegotiate a contract for a week. But you spend $20,000, $30,000 up front, and then you get this wonderful annuity. It's a very lovely business. I wish I could go invest in being a union. Unfortunately, we can't. We capitalists. But anyway, what my sense is kind of what we're doing is like that. We'll be organizing the voices of tens of millions of people and hiring the best law firms, like the Cravath, Swaine and Moore of Uruguay and the Cravath, Swaine and Moore of, Ivory Coast, and and bringing this stuff to the government and fighting and getting it done. However, I really don't, because governments are calling and leaders are calling. I don't think it's going to be that hard. I think we're going to be doing it in some places, with government agreement before we even have to go in, and before we even go in, they may already be agreeing that what we surface, they will recognize.
Hi, Patrick. Sean Lynch. Both you and Caitlin have talked about blockchain as tracking ownership of either cryptocurrency or stocks or property or whatever, but blockchain doesn't tie anything to a human being. It ties it to whoever controls a private key, right? And key management is one of the hardest problems in the interaction between humans and computers, right? It's why we don't use cryptography with long-lived private keys for the most part. Like PGP hasn't taken off for this reason. So what's your plan with T0 to help people in countries that don't even have well-developed legal systems actually manage their private keys and not get phished, not get their private keys stolen and their property thus stolen without having to resort to central solutions?
Well, first of all, let me go back a step. I do think there's going to be a place in the ecosystem for corporations. Like, for example, in our stock exchange, in our T0, we could have built T0 so it's the exchange and you don't need brokers. Everyone just has a wallet with the exchange. Our understanding is the regulators don't want to see that happen, because they don't want exchanges to be doing AML, KYC, and customer service when grandma loses a stock certificate or a key, having to deal with it. So there's still going to be a ring of brokers around the exchange who handle those functions. And I think that's a pretty good description of where the corporate evolution is going to go around this. There's all kinds of people seeing themselves getting disrupted. This is an extinction event for a lot of the financial industry as we know it. But some of the dinosaurs will evolve into birds, successful birds. And that's, to me, the avenue they evolve is to focus on all those customer services and not fight to defend all the back office that blockchain can replace. When you go overseas, well, first of all, we do everything AML, KYC, because I don't want to go to jail. And I've had 7 federal investigations, and if I do anything wrong, the feds are going to bury me under a prison. So they're not just going to put me in prison, they're going to bury me under a prison. So I'm keen on doing things AML, KYC. But in the, it's interesting, in poor countries, maybe 10%, 15% of people have a bank account, but 140% of people have a cell phone, because everybody has a cell phone. Some people have 2. And that's really the magic. It's been for decades, this discussion of the problem of the unbanked, that have bank accounts and they're cut off from the global economy and all that stuff. But since everyone has a cell phone, the more we can move this onto cell phones. So, for example, once you have land, you have capital. That was Hernando de Soto's point. Once you have the land, you have capital. Then we introduce, in Barbados, we have the world's leading blockchain meets central bank company. It's called BIT, B-I-T-T, 35% of BIT. We have a central bank on a laptop. We can go into a central bank. We've got Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, which covers 8 other countries in the Caribbean, have now signed up. And it's live in Barbados, and we're doing things in the ECCB. So for example, I'll tell you one African country, a well-known African country contacted us recently, the first advisor to the president. And we walked him through this. And he told me, we want to, as soon as possible, to have that De Soto thing. And then we want our central bank to go on BIT. And once you have everybody on BIT, BIT also includes as a central bank in a laptop, and everyone just downloads a mobile app onto their phone. So money just becomes, it's on your phone. This is live in Barbados. You can walk into a chicken shop in Barbados and buy a drumstick, which is my test, with money on your phone that's not tied to any bank account anywhere. It's just digital Bajan dollars. And soon there'll be 8 other countries with digital ECCB dollars, and soon there'll be other countries. Now, once you have that, and this is so magical to me, and this is a big thought. This is my big thought for the day. You can have on top of that, suppose we introduce a peer-to-peer lending app. So those poor people, Hernando thinks that when you do this, if we could actually globalize up the 5 billion people's ledgers, it frees many tens of trillion dollars, maybe hundreds of trillions of dollars of wealth, of capital into existence. If you have peer-to-peer lending app, well, if you have digital currency and then you have a peer-to-peer, which we're also building, and then a peer-to-peer lending app, that means those 5 billion poor people can start saving and borrowing and lending and sharing capital in a way they can start doing it immediately. What's so funny about that is for 70 years, and I'll close this answer on this note, I used to study development economics, and they used to talk about how many tens of millions of tons of copper it was going to take to wire up India. This tells you how old I was, but how many phone in every home in India, how many tens of millions of tons of copper. Then, of course, 8 years later, cell phone came along, and they realized they weren't going to do that anymore. Well, for 70 years, the West has been telling the developing world, look at our institutions and copy them. Our Wall Street and copy them. Our DTCC, copy it. Our banking institutions, and you copy. And here you have these countries, doing the equivalent of laying cable to digging holes and trenches to lay copper cable. That's what they're doing. Well, now we can go into the laptop and give them the world's most advanced land titling system, well, a laptop, and everybody downloads a mobile app. We give them another laptop, and they have the world's most advanced central bank that they can micro adjust and an unbelievable surveillance of their economic activity and perfect adjustment. They can program in the Taylor rule if they want. And then you layer on top of that a peer-to-peer lending app, all which just people download on their phones. Suddenly you have all the functionality of the most advanced Western countries' land and capital, money and capital formation processes. And you have it without any opportunities for mischief. It's all ironclad, immutable, cryptographically protected, pure. That's what I think. And you don't have to spend another 70 years building copies of our Citibank and our JP Morgan, and not that they would, that they should. I mean, it means that they can, it's like inventing the cell phone and they can skip all the 50 million pounds or tons of copper wire. That's what blockchain does. And that's why I think it is, the Bible says the poor ye shall always have with ye. Well, maybe not. I think that if the DeSoto thing works, a billion people can start practicing capitalism between consenting adults. And we all know what that's going to do for the world if it happened.
So you just mentioned, Patrick, one of the advantages to, say, a government adopting this digital currency being surveillance. I find that remark profoundly disturbing. I don't want people to be able to be surveilled. This to me is one reason, if we can have blockchain technology where it's really in the hands of the people and it's anonymous and governments can't track it, great. But, if it's going to become something that they can track, we're better off sticking with old-fudged cash, I think.
Good point. I was using surveillance of, there's a lot more fudge in the numbers that get reported in the United States about what's just the statistics that get reported about our economy. I think there's more slop in that. I think, for example, they have been deliberately understating inflation for years. I think all kinds of games get played in that, but also I think they just don't know. I think that the government's understanding of economic activity is imprecise. It's not precise. So for those who think that they should be managing that, one of the selling points is they can manage the money supply and they can understand the flows of money and manage the money supply much better with blockchain than what the system they do now. I believe they will learn that they can. That's the sense in which I meant surveillance. Does blockchain increase what is it called? The Patriot Act kind of surveillance. Well, frankly, I don't think it increases it. It does make once things are digital, it does make everything digital, immutable, and the government can find it someday. But you know what? You're kidding yourself if you think it doesn't now. Unless you're living on cash, 97% of transactions in America, I believe, do not involve cash. 90-something, last I heard. Then it's all being kept. It's all being stored. Where you're sitting right now and who you're sitting next to is stored. A year from now, they can find out who was in the room unless you all turned off your cell phones. So if you're using credit cards now or Apple Pay now or anything like that, everything's being tracked. Now, that's not to say anybody is doing it, but everything is being recorded. Blockchain doesn't make that any worse. And if you want to survive on cash, you can rip up your Visa card. I mean, you can always have cash outside your Visa card, and you can always have cash outside of blockchain. But in any case, that's not the sense in which I meant surveillance. I just meant in the sense of the Bureau of Economic Statistics trying to figure out what's actually going on in the economy so they can manage it better. I don't think they should be, but anyway, this is a selling point when I'm talking to conventional people, not people from the Mises Institute.
Hey, Patrick Byrne, thank you so much for your time. Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause.